he's a genuinely great man, and I think great men are to be revered.
Yeah, as you said, there's integrity there. Can you speak to the ideas that Ron Paul represents? Like you said, some of the things he's been right about. Maybe can you speak about the economics, the Fed, and maybe war, and being anti-military intervention?
Well, I think it all came from kind of the same central thesis, which is that the highest political value ought to be liberty. And that, you know, the government by its very nature is an instrument of force and tyranny, and that therefore the more government you have, the less liberty you have. I think he also was way ahead of his time in like really calling out the corruption in DC, and I think that's one of the things that's kind of that it's a common through line between the Federal Reserve and government spending, and of course this crazy war industry that our country has. There's a lot of components to that, but essentially Ron Paul was talking about draining the swamp way before it was like this dominant mass message. And I think Ron Paul in many ways laid the groundwork in his 2008 and 2012 presidential campaigns for not saying that he leads to Donald Trump, but he laid the groundwork for Donald Trump to be able to get up at the South Carolina Republican primary debate and look at Jeb Bush and say, your brother lied us into war. And you know what I mean? And to have the Republicans agree with him. You know, these were a lot of the same people who had voted for George W. Bush twice and supported the war and even mocked their liberal, you know, fellow countrymen for not being on board with it. And a lot of that was the work that Ron Paul did, and people waking up to how messed up all these wars were. And I think that at least there were a couple major things for me, okay, at the time. So I was a young man when I first found Ron Paul. I was in 2007 was when I first saw him, and then started obsessively reading all of his books. And so I was young. I'm born in 83, so what would that mean? 23, 24 when I first found him. So I was a young guy. And at least for me at the time, there were like kind of two categories in my, naive mind, where, okay, there were like the liberals who supported big government at home, but were skeptical about, big government abroad, or they're skeptical about wars. And then there were the conservatives who said that they supported small government, limited government at home, but were always on the side of whatever the next war is. And at least for me, and I think for a lot of people of my generation, Ron Paul was the first guy who came along and said, like, no, I'm for limited government here and abroad. And it was kind of like a portal where you could like access a different perspective on the world. And then once you saw that, you were like, wait, that's actually what makes sense. It doesn't make sense to like, what is it exactly that like all the Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush and even like Milton Friedman and guys like that, Tom Sowell, and it's like, you want a constitutionally limited world empire? Like that's what you guys stand for? Because that doesn't fit together at all. And so why is it that we were taking this as a given? And then of course the more you look into it, you realize that like, okay, those two things do make sense together. And then also that kind of like in the initial wave of like the original progressives, look, people like Woodrow Wilson or FDR, these were people who were pushing big government at home and big government abroad. And that actually made much more sense as a cohesive worldview. And to oppose that would be the Ron Paul worldview. And then the other thing for me, and this was my introduction to Ron Paul, and this too to me was like kind of a portal in a way. It was a way, at least in my naive, not fully functioned brain, or fully developed brain at 24 years old or whatever, it was a way for me to kind of get, like I tapped into something that was outside the empire. And I had heard a lot, I was already against George W. Bush, and I didn't like the war. I had already figured out, I think this war in Iraq is bullshit, and I think that we were lied into it. So I kind of got that. And then there were liberals and left-wingers who I knew. I grew up in New York City, so I was very familiar with the left-wing perspective, and who were critical of George W. Bush and for fighting the war and signing the Patriot Act into law and things like that. But I had never really heard anybody break it down the way Ron Paul did when he basically was like, look, there's a reason why these terrorists hate us. And it's not what they're telling you. They don't hate us for our freedom. It's not as if, I remember the way Pat Buchanan put it, which I always loved, was he goes, he said, Dick Cheney makes it sound like Osama bin Laden stumbled on, like in the deserts of Afghanistan, he stumbled onto a copy of our Bill of Rights somewhere. And he was like, oh my God, they're free to look at this speedy trial. Are you kidding me? Like, this is, like, what is going on here? They can own guns and their women can wear mini skirts, and that just made people so angry that they were ready to, you know, like suicide bomb themselves. And like, that makes no sense at all. And then Ron Paul was just like, no, look, here's the thing. If we think we can just go around the world killing people, propping up dictatorship, putting our military bases in the Muslims' holy land, and not engender hatred from that, then we do that at our own peril. And I thought it was such an interesting kind of, you know, it had always been, I'm an 80s and 90s kid. And to me, it was always kind of a given that, like, America's number one. We're the force for good in the world. And it was like an interesting introduction to the idea that there are people outside of that who are dominated by that, who don't care for it very much. And like that's what 9/11 was actually about. And for me, you know, I was living in New York City. I was 18, I think, when 9/11 happened. And that was like the moment of my childhood. It was a huge thing to live through. I mean, we were attacked. This seemed like something that could only happen in a history book. That didn't happen to America in the 90s. 2001 was basically the 90s. And it was just like, oh, finally it clicked. It was like, that makes sense. It's the first time I had ever heard like an explanation and an understanding of this whole thing that we're involved in now, from 9/11 to the terror wars, that actually just made perfect sense.
Yeah, we should also say that there's some degree of truth that the battle is not just militaristic, it's also cultural. And then many of those parts of the world don't want other people's values forced onto them.
Right. But the way that George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and every right-wing host in America and Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly and like everybody, what they were saying is that they hate that we're free. Whereas it was much closer to saying, like, they don't like us imposing on them. Even, like, all the hardcore neocons, Brett Stevens, of the New York Times, he wrote this piece on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, so 2023, to cheerlead the war in Iraq. And he goes through the whole piece, and there's not one mention of the million people who died in the war. You know, he literally just goes, the piece is just measure life under Saddam Hussein versus life under the Shiite parliamentary system that they have now. Which one's better? And he's arguing this one's better, therefore it was worth it. But there's like no mention. It's like, okay, but what about the 20 plus million people who were displaced? What about the million people who were killed? What about all the millions of people who were injured? What about the tens of thousands of our soldiers who have blown their brains out in the aftermath of this thing? Like, it's like so many times, this is true with government policy in general. People talk about like the end result that they want. But you're like, yeah, but what about the process by which you get there, and how much hatred, you know, could you, I mean, like, it's not that hard for me to like put myself in other people's shoes. And like, I have 2 little kids and a wife. And if anybody were to ever try to argue to me that they have to be the eggs that get broken to make some bigger omelet, like, it's okay, like, you know, we're ultimately going to impose something on your society that's better than what you have right there. It sure does suck that your wife and kids got to be the one who get taken out. I mean, I'm just saying this to myself, and this is not real, this is just a thought experiment I'm making up, I'm already pretty close to being a terrorist. Like, my next thought is kind of like, well, okay, well, I hope you're going to like it when you watch your family die in front of you, you know. Now, I'm not, hopefully, even if that happened to me, I wouldn't go kill that guy's family. Like, maybe I'd just go after him or something. But I could understand, and I think most people who have kids could understand, going to a level of like the most evil, dark place you could imagine if anyone ever threatened or actually did something to your kids.
Yeah, we have to remember the thing that's difficult to measure that you just mentioned, which is the hate that's created by every bomb that's dropped.
It was General McChrystal, who, was the general running the war in Afghanistan. He wasn't Ron Paul, you know what I mean? Like, he was a sir, yes, sir, how do we fight and win this war general. And he's the one who coined the term insurgent math. 10 minus 2 equals 20. It's like the more you keep. I was rereading about this the other day, because of the Trump's been bombing the Houthis in Yemen, and it was like when we first, I think it was in at least in 2009 is when Obama really stepped up the drone campaign with the then secret drone bombing campaign, and Yemen was one of the major theaters. And even back then, when it really was just it was a war on terrorism, like the main targets were always Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and their presence in Yemen. Even then, so before the Saudis invaded, so like from 2009 through 2015, AQAP just kept growing. He was doing all these targeted bombing campaigns. They call them targeted. 96% of the people are innocent who get killed, but they call them targeted drone bombings. And Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula just kept getting bigger and bigger because, it's like, every time you go in there, it's like, okay, you took out one target and then you took out 3 little girls and, a few. And every one of those little girls had brothers and uncles and fathers and, and all of them just signed up to join the fight now because, and I found Ron Paul was the first one who really made this click for me. But it's in a way, and I'm not a leftist, I'm not an egalitarian, I'm not a cultural relativist. I'm not saying that all cultures are the same or that we all look at the world the same way. There's enormous differences between all of us. And I personally think some are better than others. But there are things that unite all of us. And in a weird way, I remember one time I was arguing with a Democrat guy on a SE Cup show. I used to be a contributor on her show. And we were arguing, and it was after a terrorist attack here in New York, a fairly minor one. It was like a guy, I think he hit someone with his car and then jumped out with a gun, and then the cops lit him up and killed him. This is like back in 2017, I think. And he claimed to be ISIS inspired. I don't remember if there was like a direct connection or not. But they were, at the time, they were like, doesn't this mean we got to step up the war in Iraq or in Syria where ISIS's stronghold is? And I remember the guy saying to me, he goes, I went off on how these wars have been disasters. And he goes, yeah, but Dave, what you're saying here is we're supposed to do nothing? Like, this just happened and now we're supposed to do nothing? And so, even though this guy had a suit and tie on, and we're in a cable news studio, and we're in a first world country, we're in the United States of America, and we're having that, the basic thing that he's saying is like, what do you say? You're saying we're not going to go kill some motherfuckers? He was just putting it as do something, but what's something? Something is dropping bombs on human beings, when some innocent people are going to die. But okay, but it's the same thing. It's the same after 9/11. We're like, we got to go fucking invade some countries right now. That's the same impulse. It's like they killed some of our people. You think we're not going to show them who the real killers are? You think there's a chance that you could come here and that is like the most human instinct ever. It's like some other tribe just came in here and killed some people in our tribe. So what do you want to do about that? Well, I don't know. It's not going to take me too long to figure out. We're going to go kill a bunch of people in their tribe. And I do think that I think that's the major motivating factor for both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that's the major motivator for both sides of the war on terror conflict. And it's like, it's in a way, when you look at it like that, there's something, even though it's so dark and tragic, there's something almost beautiful about it where you're like, oh, we're all caught in this same cycle.
Yeah, it's deeply human, the warring between tribes. But, especially in the recent years, but more and more through human history, there's almost like a third party, which is this military-industrial complex, which is making money from the two tribes. So if you just have two tribes, one, I've been reading a lot about Genghis Khan. This is why Genghis Khan banned this. It was very common in Mongolia before Genghis Khan to steal people's wives. Like, you're my wife now.
Right.
And he realized that creates a lot of conflict.
Yeah, it sure does.
That seems natural and human, that kind of conflict. Whenever you third party rolls in and starts making money on the whole thing and then driving that forward, then the escalation of the conflict comes with this whole machine that makes de-escalation really difficult.
Yeah, the military-industrial complex in America, it's so big and it's so sophisticated and it's so it's not just that there's there's the intelligence agencies, there's the weapons manufacturers, then there's the like people in the media who are either directly or indirectly just parroting, you know what I mean, all of their talking points. And so it's not just that you can kind of like you make money when there's a conflict, but you have this entire apparatus to like create the conflict and then create the public sentiment for that. And then and it's interesting. We're in an interesting place because we're kind of in this like new frontier of now where shows like this can happen, and there's a lot of them, and a lot of them are humongous, like yours. But for so long, this just didn't exist, and it was just like, for so long, it was the case that like the New York Times and NBC and CBS and ABC and the Washington Post and the Associated Press, I guess, they could just move the nation. I mean, if they wanted to be like, hey, there is the idea that, forget even like after 9/11, the idea that in 1990, 1991, that there was any organic movement from the American people going, we really got to see about the Saddam Hussein guy. The dictator in Iraq is having a slant drilling dispute with the Emir of Kuwait. We really got to do something about that. Like, that is not something that organically came from any, that was not like a few soccer moms hanging out, watching their kids' game, being like, I think in a couple of years, we're going to have to send these boys over to Iraq. Like, that's not, they just, from the top down, were able to create this feeling that like, hey, there's a new Adolf Hitler on the rise over here in Iraq. We got to go see about this. There are these poor people in Kuwait. We have to do that. They were able to create this desire for war. That was, it's really incredible when you think about it, because I think for the most part in human history, you would have had to have some type of plausible threat, some type of plausible reality to convince people that we actually have to go to war in order to deal with this. Whereas like, the idea that in 1991, the United States of America would feel threatened by Iraq was just ridiculous. And yet they were able to do it.
Well, so to push back a little bit, throughout human history, there was also a thing. You look at the Roman Empire, where just the cultural values were different, where military conquest was seen as a good thing. So, like, we just almost assume in the United States, war has been framed in the defensive sense, like where 30 seconds offensive left. War, we're not doing that anymore.
You make a fair point. It's certainly true that throughout human history, there's been like overt empire building and wars of conquest and things like that. But I guess I'm just saying, at least even there, you would have some type of sell of like why we're going to go take these resources and why that will be good for us. Whereas the idea that they're like Kuwait just needed to be defended by the Americans seems so hard to convince anybody, and yet they were able to do it. If you read like neocon writing in the 90s, it's very interesting. Because they would tell the truth a lot more, and they were essentially, I think, there was the Soviet Union had just collapsed. It was what Charles Krauthammer dubbed the unipolar moment. There was like there was excitement, there was a feeling of invincibility, and also the neocons weren't in power. And after 92, really, I mean, they were in the George H.W. Bush administration, but after 92, they really weren't. So they're just writing at these think tanks, and it just didn't seem as, like they weren't as guarded. There weren't like these accusations of you're a war criminal or something like that. But what he said, what John Goldberg agreed with, was that I think the statement was every 10 years or so, America's got to find a puny little country and put them up against the wall just to let the rest of the world know that we mean business. And that was actually their mentality.
I'm sure there's people that agree with that. I happen to disagree with that. But the drums of war are beating a little bit over Taiwan and China.
More than a little bit, yeah.
But there I can't even see a justification for a just war. What is the long-term benefit to society if you do military intervention?
I also think this, and I've been saying this for a while, but I do think there is this like there's like this empire mentality that Americans have got to shake off. like as if it's even a question of whether we should allow it or not. Like, are we in a position to allow or not allow that? Why do we have? It's almost like if you were, like I hope China doesn't invade Taiwan. I hope Taiwan remains as free as possible. I hope China becomes free. I root for freedom and prosperity for everyone, but I also root for like everybody to have a healthy marriage. But if you were talking to me and you were like, hey, the guy down the street is cheating on his wife, like, I don't think we can allow this. I'd immediately be like, that's really not my place. And then on top of that, I also have no power. I have no authority over what they do in their marriage. Like, I have to be concerned with my marriage. And the idea that, like, imagine if there were the political will to invade Mexico. Like, if DC decided we're taking Mexico City, like that's going to be part of America now, and we're taking it by force. And then China was like, we're not sure if we can allow this. I think immediately most Americans would be like, allow? Like, how the fuck do you think you're going to stop us from taking Mexico City? What are you going to do, China? You're going to send your Navy ships over here to fight us off the coast of Mexico? Good luck with that. And at least from my understanding, in almost all the war games that they've run, if we did militarily, even if it doesn't come to nuclear weapons being used, in which case the whole world gets blown up, but even if we go to militarily try to stop China from invading Taiwan, and everyone agrees to not use nukes and we just fight a conventional war, we lose that war every time.
I think what you said applies to a lot of the wars we've been involved in, but China and Taiwan is a little bit different because of TSMC, right? Because there's an economic dependence.
If that was the concern, then the response would be, we need some type of Manhattan Project. And I'm not supporting a government project here, but there would be, we need some type of Manhattan Project to say, we're going to make these things here. We can't. And look, I was running that experiment before saying, like, what if we all pinky promise not to use nuclear weapons or something like that? But that's not the reality of the situation. The more reality, look, even in Ukraine, everybody, the biggest hawks, the biggest pushers of this policy, and Joe Biden and policy to fund Ukraine. No one's suggesting we send in the 82nd Airborne, no, which is really the only thing that could repel the Russians right now and restore, Ukrainian the original sovereignty of the Ukrainian borders. But no one's suggesting we send in the 82nd Airborne because we all know, well, we can't have a direct war with Russia. That's the end of the world. And same thing with China. So, I'm not saying microchips or whatever aren't important,
30 seconds
but
left.
we can find other ways to. Taiwan is not magical. Like, we can produce these things in other places, no?
So you have the humility to say that you don't really know much about the situation. It sounds ridiculous to say, but there's something magical about not Taiwan, but TSMC. It's incredibly difficult to manage the supply chain and manufacture at such a low cost that they are. And to add to that, China has been signaling about the one China policy, but you're absolutely right that you shouldn't be doing the Washington thing of beating the drums of war. It's like completely the counterproductive thing. You should actually try to find partnerships with China, build friendships and cooperation. Like, India is doing a good job of this. Like, build friendships. This is the 21st century. Conflict, this Cold War thinking is going to be destructive to the economy, destructive to humanity, to the flourishing of the individual nations of the world. There's just nothing positive except making money for the military industry.
Well, yeah, and it was totally destructive during the original Cold War too, and almost led to nuclear war on a couple of different occasions. But look, I would just say, and I'm no defender of the Chinese regime. I hate communism or fascism, whatever they are, some hybrid mix of the two.
They're paying you, aren't they?
Yeah, no, fuck them. I don't care. By the way, a lot of people speculate online, but I'm not getting any of these checks, man, and I'd really like them to start coming in.
Yeah.
But there's, like, even when it's like China, you say China's asserting the one China policy, but the one China policy is the policy of the United States of America and has been for 50 years now, right? So it's not, I think what's happening there a lot of times is that essentially, even though officially the one China policy is the policy of the United States of America, all of these American politicians and different figureheads across powerful centers in America are saying that China doesn't have the right to go into Taiwan. And then China's in the position of being like, well, hey, wait a minute. No, that's not actually the policy. We maintain this one China policy, but we allow them to kind of do what they want to do. And, you know, the most obvious example of this was when Joe Biden actually said, like, oh, we wouldn't allow that, and we would militarily intervene if they went into China. And then, and this was so bizarre, then the White House, whoever that was, came out to correct the president of the United States and say, no, the policy of the White House is the one China policy, which, look, I mean, again, I think the whole point of this is that the reason why whoever the hell was able to overrule Joe Biden and his administration, I don't know who that is, but the whole point is that if you say, and this is why there is some wisdom in America accepting the one China policy, is that if you tell China that we recognize Taiwan's independence and that they're not a part of China, that might be the type of thing that would make China invade and say, no, we're not accepting that. And so at least right now, it's like kind of like, okay, look, this is the reality. It's something that you kind of run up against with the war in Ukraine a lot and with the situation in China and Taiwan, is that there are constraints placed on us by reality. It's not all just how would you like the world to be? How would you like it to work? Obviously, I think we would all like that bigger countries don't invade smaller countries and bigger countries don't bully smaller countries around. That is not the way of the world. We are a big country that is the biggest bully in the world. So we're in no position to but what we're kind of in the position is just like, you're like, hey, we'd sure love if you don't do that. You know, you can do it and you can get away with it, but we would sure love it if you don't. And so the goal would be to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen. When Vladimir Putin starts talking about, like, hey, if you keep pushing the idea of Ukraine joining your military alliance, I'm going to invade that country. The goal there, or the move there, would be to be like, okay, we'll stop talking about that. Is there something else that we can agree on? You know, like, is there a way that you will promise you won't do anything to them? And we'll promise we won't bring them in our military. Like, that's the goal. You don't just go like, no, fuck you, we're doing it anyway, over and over and over again until they do the thing.
I think we got to this discussion from the military-industrial complex and military intervention and Ron Paul before that. If you can, like, rewind a little bit, is there any amount, according to you and according to various flavors of libertarianism, is there any amount of military intervention that's justified, that's okay?
Well, I would say, okay, so at least to me, in terms of like pure libertarian theory, or just in terms of like what I think is right or wrong, like there is such thing as a just war. The most obvious example of that would be like you're invaded by a military and fighting them off. So in that sense, also, like even if you wanna kind of isolate from everything else, from all of the awful U.S. policy toward Russia, Soviet Union, to all of the NATO expansion and color-coded revolutions and all of these things. If you want to, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. I do think the Ukrainians have a right to fight and protect their land. Like there's an aggressor there, and you have a right to defend yourself. So certainly in that sense, I think the American Revolution was a just war. I think there are, there can be just wars. In terms of pure libertarian theory,
I'm trying my best.
I think I would say that, look, you never have a right to kill innocent people. That's never morally okay. Now, there could be a scenario, just like this is true in life in general, right? Like there's lots of things that you don't have the right to do, but you could come up with some scenario where you might be in a position where you have to do it because there were all of these extenuating circumstances, you could think of something where, like, you remember the Saw movies where they used to, these crazy, like, horror scenarios, but it's like, okay, so there's a person, a evil bad guy has buried a key inside this person, and you have to kill that person in order to get the key, in order to unlock these 20 people to let them out of a cage. Now, look, you still don't have a right to kill people. It's horrible and wrong, and what you did there was still evil. But if you were taken to trial over it, you could probably explain to a judge and a jury, be like, I know, but the situation I was in was either these 20 people were going to die or this one person was going to die, and under that situation, I chose to save the 20. So, like, in other words, by perfect theory, no, you never have the right to kill innocent people. There could be a scenario where you were like, look, we had to take this military action and some innocent people did die. And it's so tragic and awful that we had to do this, but we are certain that many more people would have died had we not done this. Now, in that case, I would look at that as like, number one, it's much like killing the one person to save the 20. It's still wrong. It's still an immoral thing that you were forced into doing. It's not justified. I would say that the overwhelming onus should have to be on you to demonstrate that you absolutely needed to do that. And that's how I feel about all these wars. You know, it's not like, you know, I think that, like, let's just say, like, if you could make World War II, like,
Spike down.
you could reduce it down to the simplest caricature of what World War II is and say there's no Joseph Stalin. We're not even partnering with him. Like, there's a good guy in Russia who we were partnering with. And there's and the British Empire had never done anything wrong. They were just nothing but good guys. And of course, FDR was nothing but a good guy. And Hitler was even worse than the real Hitler. You know what I mean? And in order to stop them, we had to go on this bombing campaign, and we only got Nazis. We only killed the bad guys, and we were able to take out the Third Reich. But one 8-year-old girl died. And you did this thing that stopped the whole world from falling into subjugation. So I think almost everybody would agree, Jesus, man, you have to do that, okay? This is, you have to do that because the whole world's going to be subjugated. There's nothing but good guys here. The Nazis are so evil, and there's one. I still would say that every single time World War II came up, we should all just be somber, and we should all just think about that little 8-year-old girl who died, and what a horrible thing it is that we had to do that, you know? And so, like, when there are these campaigns where, like, you know, like where tens of millions of people are killed, the fact that anybody's ever like spiking the football or this kind of like rah, we were the good ones. And then also when you add in all those other complicated factors, like that this wasn't the scenario at all. But I do, so I guess essentially I'd say, no, you don't ever have a right to kill innocent people. It's never self-defense to be killing innocent people. I mean, short of like, you know, some type of scenario where like, you know, if you're holding a baby and coming at me shooting and I shoot back at you and okay, I was acting in self-defense and it happened to kill a baby. But I'm talking about like what the scenarios where you're dropping bombs on cities. It's never justified, and the overwhelming onus should be on you to demonstrate that you absolutely have to do it, and that should be the standard. Because there's so many other standards that I see thrown out that I just think make no moral sense at all. You know, people will argue about like in Gaza, they'll argue about the civilian to combatant ratio, which like that to me doesn't really. That's not what counts. That's not the measure that's important. And also, no one knows what the numbers are. They all just kind of like pretend to. And then the other thing will be that people, as someone just recently argued with me about, they'll say like, well, Hamas has to go. That's the starting point. Hamas has to go. And I'm like, no, I don't think you get to say that, because the truth is that, look, you can make an argument that Hamas has to go, sure. You can make an argument that the Likudniks have to go. You can make an argument that Kim Jong-un has to go, or that Xi has to go, or that Putin has to go, or that Zelensky has to go, or certainly I would make an argument that Joe Biden had to go. But just because a government has to go, that doesn't mean you could just go kill all their people.
Yeah, that should not be the starting point, like the assumption, the axiom of the discussion. Yeah.
The question is there no other option than doing it this way? It's like, okay, like October 7th happened. We can all agree this was like a horrific tragedy and an indefensible act of terrorism. Like, okay, is it guaranteed that another one of those is going to happen tomorrow? Or was this the biggest security failure in Israeli history? Okay, well, if it's the biggest security failure, let's just say, not even going down the inside job rabbit hole or anything like that, but just saying it's a giant security failure. Okay, then put a bunch more men at that fence, first of all. And now you got to talk about how can you achieve your goal while inflicting the minimum amount of devastation on innocent people.
Let's talk about it, since
Sure.
you brought it up. October 7th. So what exactly do you think about the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel?
Well, I mean, like what I just said, that it was horrible, and it's always, by the same logic that I'm giving you now, it's always evil to target innocent civilians. I don't believe civilians can be held responsible for the crimes of their government. This was, by the way, the Osama bin Laden logic, which I think would also be the logic of like Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Barack Obama. But Osama bin Laden very explicitly said, when he was asked, like, well, are you just going to target like U.S. military sites, or are you targeting U.S. civilians? It was an interview in the 90s before 9/11. And he goes, no, civilians are fair game too, because you guys have regular elections and you guys vote for your government, and therefore you're responsible for the crimes that they commit. Now, I think that's the logic of a fanatic like Osama bin Laden, and that's not the logic that any of us should follow. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not true that people are responsible for the crimes of their government. I think that same argument is used quite a bit by people on the pro-Israeli side when they say like, oh, they had an election in 2005 and Hamas won a plurality, therefore 20 years later, they have no rights. I think that's insane. So Hamas had no right to go after civilians. It's horrible, and you see, these, teenagers being killed, and the people, you see the images of people who were held hostage for all this time. So it's like your heart breaks for those people. It's truly tragic. I do think that it was, in many ways, an indictment of so many different things. Like October 7th happening was an indictment of the entire occupation / siege of Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter. It was, I think, should have probably forever destroyed the legacy of Benjamin Netanyahu. Who is, this isn't like George W. Bush, he was on the job for almost a year when 9/11 happened, but he was still kind of new, it was still kind of in his first year of being president. Benjamin Netanyahu was the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history and had explicitly been like, I'm the tough right winger who's going to be tough on these Palestinians, who's going to move away from the idea of coming to a two-state solution, because this is what we need to keep us safe. Like, the justification is like, I'm going to be hard on these motherfuckers because I know what it takes to keep us safe. And that culminates in the worst massacre in Israeli history. And then, the other big one is that, and it's not like I wouldn't even say an open secret at this point, it's just out in the open. He had this strategy of propping up Hamas for years. And so he had this strategy of propping up Hamas for a myriad of reasons. But a major part of it was that, look, man, as long as there's terrorists in power there's never going to be any pressure on us to give the Palestinians a state, because, look, what are you telling me I got to negotiate with them?
He was allowing Qatar money to float.
Insisting that Qatar money float to them. When the Qatar money dried up, sent the Mossad in to insist that it gets back to them. Hundreds of millions of dollars, briefcases in cash. And he said in his own words that the reason for doing this was to keep, to his words, were prop up Hamas, bolster Hamas, to keep them in power, so that the West Bank and the Gazans were divided, and that the international community, as well as the liberal Jewish community in Israel, wouldn't be able to put pressure on them to make a deal.
But what are the options? So if he doesn't allow the money in, it also looks really bad for him. Because if he's not allowing the money in, that means he's not allowing the quote-unquote aid in to help the Palestinians.
Yeah, but Lex, the dynamic here, right, is from 2007 to today. Israel's had a full blockade around the country. They won't let potatoes in. They won't let sugar in. They won't. And the justification is because they're dual use. They can be used to make rockets, as well as they can be used to feed starving children. So we can't let that in because it's dual use. But cash to Hamas?
I'm buying.
Does that not have dual usage? Like, is there nothing else that they can? So yeah, it's like, yes, when you have a full blockade around the country, you take on certain responsibilities. And I think this is the essence of really the whole struggle here, which is very tough, I think, for the pro-Israel side to grapple with. But the bottom line is that Israel hasn't occupied Palestine for like a few months after a war, or even a couple of years after a war, while they're figuring out what we're going to do with them. It's been over 60 years. We're talking about a 1 week long war, or a day short of a week long war, in 1967. Israel's had control of them ever since. And much like in the same way that, like, if you kidnap someone and you lock them in your basement and you don't feed them, you murdered that person. So in other words, stated differently, you're not allowed to kidnap people and lock them in your basement. But once you do, you take on a responsibility to feed those people. You know what I mean? Like, you're not allowed to keep someone and not feed them. That is a worse charge than just keeping them. And so, yeah, anyway, I guess my point is, the solution to that, if you go like, well, I'm a bad guy if I fund Hamas, I'm a bad guy if I don't let the aid in, was to let the reputable international aid organizations bring aid in to the people of Gaza. Don't pressure the Qataris to send in briefcases full of cash. Allow internationally recognized, reputable human rights organizations who are lining up trying to do it. Stop turning them away. Let them in. And this is just, it's so long past due. I mean, like, it's just, I'm not like defending Arab terrorism. It's I think it's really, it's a tragedy that the Arabs embraced terrorism. I don't think it's unique to them. And in fact, I think it was the Zionist militias who introduced terrorism to that part of the world. But there was also terrorism persists because it works. And this is true with state terrorism and with non-state terrorism. It's like terrorism has often worked for people. I think the thing, like early Yasser Arafat, I know, was very influenced by the Algerians, who, successfully kicked the French out at embracing terrorism. And it was almost like the major miscalculation of those Palestinian Arabs who did embrace terrorism was that this isn't the French. This isn't the French hanging out in some colony with their home country back home, where maybe a few acts of violence could work enough to, the liberal population back home is like, oh, I really didn't like the response to that terrorism. We killed so many people. Forget it. This is too much of a headache. Let's get out of here. The Zionist settlers were there to stay. They weren't going anywhere. They weren't going back to Eastern Europe. You know what I mean? They weren't. They were just that. And so it's a tragedy that this whole thing went the way it did. But you always, whenever you're talking about like a conflict like this, the person who has the party who has the power is the one who needs to make concessions. And it's just indefensible that the status quo of the Palestinian people having no rights, literally no rights, being ruled by a government that they do not get to vote for or against, no right to do commerce with the outside world, no freedom of travel, no freedom of movement, no basic property rights. You can be kicked out of your home at any time, no right to a fair trial, no right to a lawyer, no right to a jury of your peers. I mean, the fact that that has been the status quo since 1967 is just indefensible. And then in the context that has been the status quo, I guess I'm just not, even though I'm against it, it's kind of like when you're just lecturing about the way in which they resist this, I think it's very tough to be on strong moral footing, Yeah,
you have to really empathize with decades of suffering in the region. I suppose my question was grounded in how can the Israeli government, how can the world help the Palestinian people flourish? So you suggested allowing reputable aid organizations in, but that's kind of almost patching, just helping humans who are suffering. But that's not how you have a nation flourish. You have to build up the infrastructure. You have to build up a culture of the education system, the democratic processes of electing and regular elections, and so that the people are represented, and you have to form partnerships, friendships, normalization of relations with the Arab world, with Israel, travel back and forth, and lessen the chokehold, like the security chokehold, that you could say is justified in a militaristic situation. But why is it a military situation? The question is there, like, where do we go from here? If we, we'll talk about Netanyahu some more. He is, he's very criticized inside Israel as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe less so after October 7th because, again, in the same way you can empathize with the Palestinian people, you can empathize with Israelis, where October 7th touched, just like it did for Americans with 9/11, it touched some kind of primal thing
100%.
Of fear, of like,
oh yeah, and like
holy shit.
The same thing I said before, like I could also very easily go, if one of my kids was like at that rave or something like that and just got gunned down or kidnapped I could understand being like, level the whole goddamn place. And I'm sure I would feel that way if that was one of my kids, So yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, there's lots of examples in the world of, like France and Germany are right next to each other, and Ireland and England are right next to each other, and they're just totally living in harmony right now. Like there is just the thought of them going to war is like inconceivable right now. Not saying it could never happen in the future, but it seems pretty hard to imagine. And that being the case would have been very hard to imagine for a very long time. There's some serious levels of brutality between those two societies, and even more directly it involved, Egypt and Israel went to war 4 times in a couple decades. They went to war, and then in the late 70s they made a land for peace deal, and they haven't been to war since. And like I do at least try to hold out that like that is, it's not like Egypt is, you're not going to say they don't have an issue with radical Islam in Egypt. You know what I mean? Like that's not the answer. It's just that they made a land for peace deal. And once that was solved, it was kind of easier to avoid the war. And I do like to think that there could be a solution to the Israel-Palestine question, but it's going to have to involve Israel taking their boot off of the Palestinians' neck. And I know that that's scary. And I understand that there are like legitimate concerns about that. There's the great Thomas Jefferson quote about slavery, which was we have the wolf by the tail, and we can neither afford to hold on to him nor risk letting him go. Which is like, you could see where that would have been like a real concern of people, like right toward the end of slavery, or whatever, in the early 1800s, say the first half of the 19th century, where you'd be like, okay, we recognize this is wrong now. But we've had these millions of people enslaved for all these years. If we let them go, they're going to fucking kill us. And what are you saying? They're citizens now, meaning the Second Amendment applies to them, meaning that the guy who I enslaved now can get a gun? You know what? And so, okay, there are these, but I think in hindsight, looking back at it, we would all just go, yeah, but you can't enslave people. So like, whatever risks come with the next phase of this, unfortunately, like you're going to have to just deal with that and move. You have to start with abolishing slavery.
And it is good to also remember, in the hopeful message you send, like at any day you can make a deal. And that's one of the frustrating things I had with I hosted a debate on Israel. It's like, it just felt hopeless, and a lot of people I talk to, it feels hopeless. But like, I have a lot of, I maybe naively see a lot of possibilities of peace there. I see, for example, normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then Saudi Arabia taking some ownership over Gaza, something like that. Some interesting. Where a big major player in that region takes ownership and steps as the middleman.
Yeah, I agree with you, and you're 100% right that, and even before October 7th, I think many steps had been taken away from, the peace process and the feeling of that. I mean, really, I think since the second Intifada is when like the appetite for peace, I think in Israel was greatly diminished. But to your point, I mean, it's going to take really painful concessions on all sides in order to get there. And I think that personally, I think, and I don't know if I say this for not necessarily like the Arab world, but at least the nation states, like their governments, I think are pretty much there. Like Saudi Arabia and UAE and Jordan and Egypt, like if the Israelis, they're almost like, look, these are American sock puppets, for the most part, right? And so their thing is that like, okay, 100% of my population is completely opposed to what Israel's doing to Palestine right now. And they just hate that that the nation was created at all, that all the Arabs were kicked out of what is, very important land to them religiously. And so the governments there are like, look, we want to continue to have U.S. tax dollars flooding in here. We'd love to make a deal with Israel, but like, you gotta stop doing this to the Palestinians so my own people don't rise up against me. So I think if the Israelis were like, fine, we'll do a two-state solution or something like that, I think Saudi Arabia couldn't wait to broker. In fact, they proposed a two-state solution just a few years ago. I mean, they would love to be a part of that, normalize relations. Amongst the Palestinians, like, which again, I think this had been accepted multiple times, at least by their leadership. It's like, you're going to have to accept that, like, you lost in 48. You're going to have to accept that you lost in 47. You're going to have to accept that the state of Israel does exist. And you're going to have to accept that, like, the right of return is not going to literally mean that everybody can go back to where they were. And what Israel's going to have to concede is that it was awfully fucked up that they kicked a lot of people out of their land. And that the whole a land for a people without land was never true. That was just a slogan that felt good to avoid what you guys actually did. And the fact that it was inexcusable that you guys occupied these people for 60 years, and that has to end immediately.
I interviewed Douglas Murray recently. He just wrote a book on Israel and Hamas called On Democracies and Death Cults. He makes what I think is a strong pro-Israel case, focusing on Hamas as an evil organization, evil for its corrupt leadership, who's essentially stealing money from the Palestinian people and allocating the money that is there towards militaristic operations versus like building up Gaza. Can you steelman the case for and then against this perspective? Sort of centering, we've been talking about the people, about centering around Hamas, which is like this extremist religious organization. The perspective being like they need to be, as you mentioned before, eliminated before any progress can be made.
Okay, so if I were Steelman Douglas Murray's case, I would say, well, I guess the case is right. Look, Hamas is a fanatical death cult, essentially, which I do think is a fair description of them. There is no question that they have pursued a path that was just devastating to their own people. And there's no question they have not spent the resources they have on, their priority has not been uplifting their own people. Their priority has been, I think, essentially antagonizing Israel into this overreaction so that they can turn world opinion against Israel. I think they've been very effective at doing that. And okay, again, I think the argument would come back to something like, and the people kind of voted for this in 2005, and the people we sure do see a lot of people cheering when Hamas is doing some pretty horrific stuff. And so, hey, you got that on one side, and you have a kind of a country that's much more similar to Western societies on the other side.
If we can just like linger on that, Steelman, what do you make of the celebrations in Gaza after October 7th?
I think it's sickening and incredibly disturbing. I guess the way I look at it, I always, and maybe there is a degree of like naivete to this, or perhaps it's just that I just don't want to allow myself to go down a certain path because I think it leads to such dark outcomes. But I just always I always try to be kind of like against the government, for the people, against the powerful, sympathetic to the powerless. I think that, look, it's sickening. You see big crowds cheering on, people who have been, with these people who have been in captivity for I think some of them for over a year and a half. I also thought when Nikki Haley and other Israeli politicians are signing the bombs before they're launched into Gaza, I found that sickening. I think there's all types, I think like mission accomplished banners and flying on jet. I mean, I think I think having Bob Hope specials at the end of the Persian Gulf War was sickening. I just think all of it is like horrific.
One enemy remaining.
I look at it and I try to say to myself, okay, we had one 9/11 in this country, and we all, like, collectively, we lost our minds as a society. We were ready to go bomb whoever the hell our politicians told us to bomb, and we didn't care how many people it killed. And we killed a lot more than Israel or Hamas has killed doing it. And I try to think to myself, okay, imagine being trapped in what is, people can call it whatever they want to. I do think Pat Buchanan and these guys were right to call it a concentration camp. But you're trapped in a 5-mile by 25-mile area where you cannot leave. You are stuck there. You don't have an airport because the Israelis bombed it. You don't have a seaport because they won't allow you. You have no access to trade with the outside world. And you're not suffering through a 9/11. You're suffering through 1,000 9/11s. Your whole life is bad. The people in Gaza their entire life has been being refugees. You know what I mean? Their entire life. There's generations of people have been in this status now. And so, if my society lost its mind after one 9/11, I just have a tough time like judging the people who came up in this environment. But there's no question it is. I mean, it's, profoundly disturbing.
But I wonder how much of the indoctrination is really made the software of their mind permanently anti-peace.
Yeah.
It's like extremify them. And that, it doesn't justify anything, but it's more concerning for the prospects of peace.
Well, I'd say I get your point. It's an interesting question that I don't know if any of us know exactly the answer to, but I would say that, like, even after, what was it, 80 years of the Soviet Union, it's like, and there were real debates back then about like the new communist man and whether the minds had been so warped of people that they would never even care about these things like liberty or national identity or independence. And then yet at the end, it was all still there. It was very repressed and it went underground and people weren't allowed to talk about it, but they all still had it. And in fact, I was just listening the other day to this Murray Rothbard speech from like the early 90s, and he was talking about how there was something where there was like a camera crew interviewed like a Chinese family under real deal Chinese communism. I believe it was before Mao Zedong died, and they were like, they were just saying all this crazy shit to the camera. Like they were like, would you rather, your sons are like healthy and live good lives, or would you rather they suffer but be loyal obedience to the state? And they were like, we would rather they be obedient to the state and blah, 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 and all these things. And Murray Rothbard was saying he saw this interview and he was talking to his friend. He was, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, it's hopeless. These people's minds have been warped. And then he was talking to his friend who's like a China expert who had been there a lot. And he was like, no, they're not. That's what they say when the cameras are around. As soon as the cameras go, like, they're. So anyway, I'm just making the point there that like there is like, look, even in the situation with Israel and Gaza, specifically Gaza, not even the West Bank, when you could look at it, when the peace talks were going on, support for Hamas plummeted. When the peace talks fell apart, support for Hamas went way back up. Every time there's an aggressive military campaign, support for Hamas goes back up. So I just think that, like, I'm more hopeful than not that, like, you could get to a place where, like, but it requires, like, you have to, like, if you do understand the Ron Paul point about blowback, the General McChrystal point about insurgent math, you just realize that it's like, you're you're fighting in a way that produces more of the thing that you're fighting. And so the first step is to stop doing that. Like your cure is making the patient more sick. So stop doing that, and then let's see if maybe we could heal.
What about the case against the Douglas Murray case of the death cults, and that a fundamental part of this process, Hamas needs to be eliminated?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would just say that, and I'm not saying this as a fan of democracy. I'm not like a big believer in democracy. I believe in liberty, and I think democracy is often not in line with liberty.
The Chinese government paid you to say that as well? Or?
That's literally all I had to get out. But I get to say what I want the rest of the podcast.
Great,
but just that I had to. No, I don't. Well, no, I mean, my beef with the Chinese government would not be that they don't hold regular elections. My beef with them would be that they silence speech, that they people in camps and things like that, the surveillance, that stuff. I think, look, when you call Israel a democracy, which I guess is right in the title of his book. And I, full disclosure, I haven't read the book, but I have listened to some of his thoughts on this stuff. I think you run up against a real problem, which is that the creation of the state of Israel, even though he tried to walk away from those comments, as Norm Finkelstein called out Benny Morris for writing in his book 1948, which is a great book, his words were, the Zionist project always knew it was going to involve transfer. That was Benny Morris's words. Now, when Finkelstein was grilling him on this on your podcast, he kind of said like, yeah, but that doesn't mean ethnic cleansing. That could be voluntary transfer. You know what I mean? Like, but the point is, the Zionist settlers, and they spoke about this openly, they all knew they had a major problem, which is like, well, you can't create a Jewish state if it's like 50-50, which is, and in all of Israel, it was much less than 50-50, but even in like the Israeli portion of the partition recommendation, it was very close to 50-50. Now, you can't really have a Jewish state with a 50-50 voter base, because now you're just kind of in a breeding war for the next generation, and or who turns out the vote any more than we could hope. It would be the prospect right now of making America an official Republican state or an official Democrat state. Well, how are you going to do that, man? It's like 50-50 between the two. And so I think what Benny Morris was saying was that they always knew some of these Arabs are going to have to get moved out of here so that we could have more of something, which ultimately where they got to like an 80-20, which is pretty much what Israel's maintained the whole time. Now, Benny Morris could quarrel about